The dust has settled after the final release of Guild Wars 2's latest expansion, Secrets of the Obscure. It's been an eventful couple of years for ArenaNet as a studio, and Secrets of the Obscure is the beginning of an entirely new development strategy, focused on much more frequent yearly expansions at a lower price point and a move away from the previous Living World model, which was based around expansions every few years and then supplementary follow-up content in between. Secrets of the Obscure essentially combined those ideas, with an initial expansion content drop and then 3 quarterly releases afterwards, leading into another expansion. The reasoning behind this was that the Living World was not sustainable, because it was given away for free to existing players just for logging in, and the model also did not allow ArenaNet to maintain all areas of the game. The end result is that Guild Wars 2 expansions going forwards are essentially half the content of the previous model, but twice as fast, with a bunch of extra core game improvements added on top. And, on initial examination, and in theory, that's exactly what happened. The releases of Secrets of the Obscure are roughly equivalent to half of an old expansion and Living World season, except with a lower overall open world map count. One other very important thing that changed with Secrets of the Obscure is the lack of elite specializations, which are subclasses added to every profession that often radically change gameplay and open up new build opportunities. This time, and going forward, these will be replaced by different combat features, which in the case of Secrets of the Obscure were new weapons for each profession, and also the ability to use weapons previously locked to elite specializations on any build. That should just about set the scene and gets us ready to discover the secrets of the Obscure. First up, let's talk about the world. The world of Secrets of the Obscure looks and sounds fantastic. It's very much an extension of the world of Guild Wars 2, but with a very different spin. What I think ArenaNet absolutely nailed here was creating an almost alien environment and then throwing the player into it. The architecture is weird and imposing. You can actually get lost in corridors that don't go anywhere and get surrounded by massive towering spires. In Secrets of the Obscure, the normal rules of reality do not always apply. You, as the player, are thrust into a world you never knew existed, facing a demonic threat that threatens to feast on the souls of everyone you know and love. Fortunately, there is a band of wizards, who you also never knew existed, who are keeping the demons, known as the Cryptis, at bay. Until now. The Cryptis are horrible, fleshy entities that don't quite always manage to live up to their concept art. I think ArenaNet didn't want to go as Dead Space as I would have liked them to, and that's fair enough. Guild Wars 2 is not a survival horror game unless you count world versus world ganking or using the looking for group feature on the North American servers. They still look weird and pretty cool, and if you like tentacles, well, you're in for a good time. The more central Cryptis characters do have some epic designs that really do capture that fleshy, monstrous, grotesque appearance very well. They've broken through the walls of the world, and they're here to devour everything in their path. And they sort of look the part. You had better enjoy fighting Cryptis too, because they are pretty much the only enemy you'll be up against in the whole expansion. There's a little bit of variety on the first map, but after that, it's more or less Cryptis all the way down. That lack of variety is justified by the nature of the story, but I do think that finding a way to inject more enemy types, especially towards the end of the expansion in the quarterly releases, would definitely have been welcome. Counter to the Cryptis are the Astral Ward, mystical wizards who have guided and defended the world beyond the sight of mere mortals. They are strange, which is exactly how they should be. They operate in an entirely different sphere and culture to what you're used to, and it's refreshing to walk into a world where you are a complete noob, as opposed to an unstoppable one-man army of destruction for once. Overall, the premise of the expansion is somewhat unhinged and out of left field, but the game pulls it off marvelously, very much living up to the title of Secrets of the Obscure. Now that the scene has been set, we are almost ready to talk about the meat of any Guild Wars 2 expansion, the open world. But before we dive in, I want to give a special mention to the music. Guild Wars 2 has always had a very solid soundtrack, but I must say that Secrets of the Obscure may actually be my favorite. It takes a much darker, more ominous, heavier tone, filled with demonic chants and roars that do an incredible job of reminding you that this isn't part of the plan, and something is terribly wrong. And on the other side of the spectrum, the more ambient and calm tracks are filled with mystery, stillness, and the wisdom of the ages. It's quite magical. The music, combined with the visual design and setting, creates some really impressive world building, some of the strongest in the game in my opinion, and certainly the most out there and different from what you might expect, which I'll admit I do like specifically. The only criticism I have is that there isn't enough, and the soundtrack is smaller than usual, and you'll definitely be hearing the same tracks fairly frequently. It's possible this was due to the apparently quite fast turnaround for producing the soundtrack. However, what we did get was really good, and I'll now let some of the tracks speak for themselves. With that out of the way, I'm afraid you've got to listen to me again. Let's get into the open world. Secrets of the Obscure takes place through 3 maps: Skywatch Archipelago, Amnitas, and Inner Nyos. Additionally, the wizards hang out in their special floating tower, and you can too. I think the setting of the first map is the most interesting concept. It turns out the wizards are at least a little bit morally grey, or at the very least apathetic, as they've essentially manifested islands of alternate timelines to see what happens when things go badly wrong throughout history as a fun science experiment. The only bad news is that all of the citizens of these islands are very much real and are currently experiencing the wonders of being oppressed by a robot uprising, a fire god of war, angry dwarves, and more. I like the idea a lot, and it's developed very well through both the smaller event chains, character conversations and dialogue, and lore books scattered about the place. The big climax of the map is linked to the main story and revolves around forging a key to the Wizard's Tower. Very cool. While we're on the topic of Skywatch Archipelago, I want to talk about asset reuse, which was a heavily criticized aspect of Secrets of the Obscure, in large part because of the fact that Skywatch Archipelago, and indeed some other parts of the expansion, are composed of environments, enemies, and assets that are not original to Secrets of the Obscure. I would say this criticism is unwarranted when it comes to the environmental design. Despite the asset reuse, the maps and instances of Secrets of the Obscure are some of the most distinctive in the game, and it was actually quite good fun to spot how the developers had taken objects from the game's history and reused them in creative ways. However, I do think it would have been nice to have some more new animations for enemies, as most enemies in the expansion are using reused animations. To be clear, it actually worked out well from a visual standpoint. Reusing animations is not inherently bad. Quite the contrary, in fact. It's sensible development practice. The point is that encountering enemies with novel animations and movements is always exciting, and that is more limited in Secrets of the Obscure, and it can be a little strange to see supposedly otherworldly demons running around with the same walking animations as player characters. Amnitas is the fabled home and city of the wizards. Its massive, imposing structures will melt your graphics card, and it's also being invaded by demons. The spiraling, motionless architecture suspended over nothingness is quite breathtaking, beckoning you forth to explore what mysteries and dangers lie within. The stillness of both the visuals and the soundtrack, combined with the scale, is right on theme, and the marks of the demonic corruption spreading over buildings, while initially hidden, eventually become all too apparent. This map is pretty epic. Like the first map, there are event chains that will take you all over the place, and there's a lot to explore and uncover. It's very much a maze too, and you'll have to plunge into the unknown to find the hidden secrets of the obscure. The final map of the expansion, Inanios, was released over all 3 quarterly releases, a third at a time. It's the realm of the demons. It's very much what you'd expect, spooky in shades of red and grey, even featuring a dark simulacrum of the spires of Amnitas as the final target for players. I don't think this map is quite as inspired as the others, and it's maybe perhaps a little too gloomy for my liking. The Cryptis visuals are really at their best, where there's a bit more light in play, and there are areas where they do shine, but most of the map is a bit of a grey soup. Nios isn't as well fleshed out from the lore perspective either, and the map is overall much more focused around the main storyline. The reason for this is simple. Because the map was released in 3 parts, what happened is that ArenaNet ended up essentially making 3 very small maps jammed together with a lot less room for ambient storytelling. This is an approach that didn't really work out and is very deliberately being changed in future expansions for this very reason. The main large event over the entirety of Inanios is all about the path to breaking into an imposing citadel to face the final villain of the expansion, and, like the others, it's quite the spectacle. But on that note, we do now have to talk about the elephant in the room. The open world in Secrets of the Obscure looks and sounds incredible, but the gameplay does not match at all. Don't get me wrong, when you play through this for the first time, it is epic, and you'll be swept away by the sheer scale of everything going on. But you'll eventually realize the game is making you spend most of your time collecting orbs, and not really providing you with an engaging combat experience, which is a massive disappointment. In fact, probably the biggest disappointment for me in the entire expansion. Guild Wars 2's greatest strength has always been large-scale content, and sadly, it's not a strength present in Secrets of the Obscure. I think it's some of the weakest content of that type in the entire game's history, shielded from last place only by Path of Fire, which didn't really even bother to add big boss-style events outside of bounties, but, well, that really is a story and a topic for another time. This failure to create compelling encounters is unfortunately a bit of a theme throughout the expansion that we will be getting into later in greater depth in the encounter design section of this video. But suffice to say, when a massive city-devouring tentacle monster is sitting around doing nothing and a big bad crab demon is literally in an idle animation for most of the fight, something has gone terribly wrong. It's a real shame because thematically the fights are excellent. Performing a bizarre yoga ritual to banish a weakened demon back into the abyss is awesome. Pressing 2 while hovering on a dragon over and over to blow up its eyes and hitting it while it doesn't even fight back is not. Breaking into a wizard's tower because we're locked out is a captivating premise. Running around collecting orbs without doing much fighting is not. The open world of Secrets of the Obscure will always be a huge what-if for me. I think the setting and premise are absolutely fantastic. I just wish the substance behind the style was comparable to ArenaNet's previous best-in-industry open-world offerings. The story of Secrets of the Obscure takes place after the Elder Dragon Saga, which was the original epic story arc spanning the first 10 years of Guild Wars 2's development. It's the first new story in the game to be entirely standalone from this dragon storyline. As you can imagine, this is quite the change of pace, and attempting to de-escalate down a little bit from dragons the size of buildings isn't easy. I was definitely intrigued by what was going to happen in the story. It was clear the writing was taking a darker tone from what we'd previously seen, with a particularly exciting tease of the main villain in the expansion reveal. This was of particular note to me because Guild Wars 2 has historically struggled to consistently create compelling antagonists in the main storyline. Alongside that, the developers clearly wanted to create an almost alien environment that was very different to anything the player had experienced before, to really create this feeling of being a fish out of water, and in this I will say they definitely succeeded. From a visual and auditory perspective, Secrets of the Obscure is a significant tonal shift from the rest of the game in almost every way, which is very welcome. ArenaNet very much come out swinging here. What starts out as a seemingly innocuous wizard-themed mystery takes a dark turn into a horrific demonic invasion that has the historically overpowered player character running for their life from a battle they can't hope to win. However, after the very strong start, the story as a whole is definitely overscoped for the approximately 4-hour playtime, leading to many threads and characters feeling very rushed and underdeveloped. The final act and confrontation in particular is lightning fast, and doesn't quite end up being quite as much of a crescendo as it should have been. I think the fatal mistake was that ArenaNet wanted to have a complete story in the initial expansion drop, and then a linked follow-up story in the quarterly releases. The end result is that neither arc really has enough time to shine, especially the follow-up story, which is in some ways more ambitious in scope than the expansion story. Each quarterly release only had around an hour of story playtime, so I think you can see the issue here. It's just not enough time to fit another story arc in. The quarterly releases also make the bizarre decision to move away from the darker, mysterious theme of the expansion towards a much more predictable tale, with some almost goofy elements in it, which is incredibly jarring, and absolutely does not land at all in my opinion. The next bad guy and ultimate villain of the entire expansion is almost comically underdeveloped, and a massive downgrade from the first antagonist. It feels confused, and definitely not in the good way. On top of that, a large amount of story runtime in the quarterly updates is exposition from characters talking at you, with a relatively limited amount of actual gameplay. This is also the case for the main expansion story, but to a lesser extent. ArenaNet pad this out by adding multiple segments where you have to close rifts or complete general events around the area in order to give you gameplay attached to the story, but if I'm honest, that's not good enough, because ultimately it's a huge flow break to essentially take a break from the story to do essentially semi-unrelated content to fill a green bar before moving on to the next step. What's interesting here is that the big open world map events are directly part of the story lore-wise, but you don't have to complete them during the story, which would make a huge amount of sense. In fact, it could be argued if you don't do that, then you'll actually be missing out on some key story events, especially in the final map of the expansion, which could end up being confusing and make the experience somewhat disjointed. The reason ArenaNet can't do this is because the events require a large amount of players to complete, and are on a time-based rotation, which would mean that players might have to wait a long time to progress the story, or struggle to complete it at all if maps end up dead. I think an interesting approach that ArenaNet could try down the line to rectify this will be to create a story version of the maps that players can play through during the story with the help of non-player characters, which could not only express the story through gameplay, but also ensure a cohesive narrative experience for players. Gameplay development really does seem to be the bottleneck here. There is a lot of story to be told, but not enough game to tell it. The amount of optional, fully voiced dialogue, text conversations, lore books, and more lying about the place is absolutely massive, almost to the point of insanity. You will easily double or even triple your playtime by listening to it all. But for whatever reason, ArenaNet was not able to develop enough gameplay to deliver the narrative they wanted to share. To go any further, I need to mercilessly spoil the story. So if you don't want that, skip to the next section. You have been warned. Okay then, let's get caught up with what happens in Secrets of the Obscure. The main storyline has a bored player character trying to figure out what to do after saving the world once again. You end up investigating some mysterious wizards before being sucked into a terrifying rift while everyone seems to be losing their minds. You are then confronted and nearly devoured by the imposing Ceres, who beats you up, and then you run for your life. Assisted by a mysterious voice, you escape and meet some familiar faces and the Astral Ward. It turns out that in an amusing turn of events, a whole bunch of people actually knew about the existence of the secret space police, but the player character, who more or less soloed multiple world-ending threats, is too much of a scrub to be let in on the secret. The bad news is that the leader of the ward, the enigmatic Isgaran, is missing. The Cryptis are possessing everyone and driving them insane, and nobody really knows what's going on, and you can't even get into the legendary Wizard's Tower. Over the course of the story, you break back into the Wizard's Tower, battle countless Cryptis, put down a couple of your own allies who have been possessed by the fiendish demons, and eventually rescue the Wizard Lord. You then immediately get sucked back into a final confrontation with Ceres, where you once again get completely destroyed. All this time, you've been constantly being haunted by this mystery voice, to the point where you think you're getting possessed too. Well, it turns out that was Paitha, the sister of Ceres, who initially appears to have been baiting you into this the entire time, but right before Ceres is about to feast on you, Paitha double-crosses Ceres, and you form a hasty alliance to end him, while Isgaran lies on the floor like a lemon. The reason for this summary is to illustrate that the first part of the story that dropped on launch and had Ceres as the main antagonist, was a very solid start. You are constantly kept guessing about what's really going on behind the scenes, and whether you should trust what you're hearing from the wizards, and of course, from your mystery voice. Even Isgaran, the ultimate supposed guardian of Tyria, is revealed to not be quite what you're expecting. The story does a good job of maintaining the mystery and keeps you on your toes, and as the expansion ends, you form an uneasy alliance with Paitha and some of the Cryptis, who apparently don't want to eat your soul, but you just don't really know how it's going to go. Who can you trust, and how are the different factions going to interact? Isgaran openly says that he would happily sacrifice all of the Cryptis to get the job done, and Paitha suggests that she'd like to eat you on a few occasions. The setup is done, and perfect for some really interesting, unpredictable gaming. And then comes one of the biggest throws in storytelling I've ever seen. For some reason, ArenaNet decided to go for the epic subversion of expectations by making it so the Cryptis aren't actually evil at all. They are just being oppressed by Epoch, a demon much less impressive than Ceres and who skips leg day. There is also a bizarre tonal shift going into the post-launch story where many Cryptis almost end up being goofy and a bit ridiculous, alongside the still dark main plotline. It's confused, and I don't think it worked at all. Sometimes it's good for the bad guys to actually just be the bad guys, and the decision to not make this the case in the full-on demonic invasion was a big mistake in my opinion. The story also really struggles to develop Epoch. He doesn't even show up until the end of the second quarterly release, so his amount of screen time is insanely low, and throughout the entirety of his role in the story, essentially just sits in his citadel and does nothing before being promptly defeated by the player and destroyed by Paitha. You're even sort of robbed of an epic final confrontation. Epoch supposedly has a massive, uncountable demon army to beat down, but it turns out he just ate them to power himself up, which is supposed to be a horrifying reveal, but even that falls flat because when you stumble into what is supposed to be a grotesque display of trapped Cryptis essence, the visuals just don't convey that well at all. There's interesting stuff here and there, details about how Epoch originally worked with Isgaran, who, funnily enough, completely ignored all of the signs of Epoch slowly becoming unhinged. Epoch resisted the urge to feed before finally being unable to do so, and then vows revenge after being unceremoniously thrown out. This casts some serious doubt over not only the moral compass and judgment of Isgaran, but also whether the Cryptis are even capable of coexisting. They're initially set up as being predators who latch onto worlds and eat them whole, but all of that ends up feeling incredibly hollow because of how much they get humanized throughout the story. It ends up being a very predictable story that tries to get you that something crazy might happen by having the two sides posture at each other, but you know that nothing will because the established rules of the story have walked it into a narrative dead end. At the end of the day, there's just not that much you can do in such a short space of time, and therein lies one of the major issues with the Nios storyline of Secrets of the Obscure. I think there's a version of the story that could have been interesting, but it never stood a chance with an hour of runtime every 3 months. The main story also felt decidedly rushed, with a very large amount of characters being introduced only to be underdeveloped or killed, and that gets dialed up to 11 in the quarterly releases. It's a frustrating experience because there was some real potential in the excellent setting of the expansion, but it's not fully capitalized on. It turns out that ArenaNet agree with this criticism and concede that the story they wanted to tell was too big for the expansion in their retrospective post, so theoretically, future expansions shouldn't suffer from this to the extent as Secrets of the Obscure, so that's good. Secrets of the Obscure added quite a wide range of features to the game. I think the approach was fairly scattershot and experimental. ArenaNet wanted to try a bunch of stuff and see what worked and what didn't in their new release structure, and as a result, it's no surprise that some features and practices absolutely shine where others don't really work out. The feature set as a whole is particularly great for newer players and more solo-oriented players. So, what exactly are these features then? Starting off strong is the Wizard's Vault, a long overdue update to the daily system. One major criticism of Guild Wars 2 is that the game is a bit overwhelming and hard to figure out what you're supposed to do to get the epic loot. The Wizard's Vault addresses this issue extremely well by essentially being a non-terrible version of a battle pass. The Vault has a bunch of rewards ranging from cosmetic items to crafting materials, even a mount skin, which are usually exclusive to the gem store, that you can purchase for astral acclaim. You get this currency by doing, well, just about anything you want. You can select what activities you're interested in, and then the game will feed you daily, weekly, and special objectives that are extremely rewarding. Unlike a battle pass, you can get rewards in any order you like, and they don't have a limited time either. When new rewards rotate in, old ones simply go to the legacy section, and you can still pick them up for a slightly higher price. The highlights for me are the ability to buy best-in-slot gear in a very accessible way for new players, and also the legendary starter kits. Legendary items are the ultimate endgame reward in Guild Wars 2, and broadly speaking are the grinding aspirational loop that keeps many players in the game. The funny thing is that there isn't really anything in the game that has ever communicated this super well to the player, leaving players quite often not totally sure what they should be going for when they have their characters fully set up. These starter kits not only are very obvious for players to investigate, but are also just a fantastic jumpstart in getting your hands on these items. I think the Wizard's Vault massively improved the new player and casual player experience in Guild Wars 2 by providing basic, varied, and rewarding goals. I really can't overstate how much easier it is for new and casual players to build up their characters and reach goals thanks to the Wizard's Vault. It's a very good addition to the game. There are certainly some issues with task variety, but because this is a core game feature now, this is certainly going to improve over time. The next thing I want to talk about is not a single feature, nor is it directly linked to Secrets of the Obscure, but in my opinion, it is the most important benefit of ArenaNet shifting their development strategy: the core game improvements. Guild Wars 2 has always struggled to maintain and support its many game modes, to the point where world versus world, player versus player, raids and dungeons have all been semi-abandoned at best. Over the last couple of years, we have seen great improvement in this area, which has significantly enhanced pretty much every part of the game. I can say without a shred of irony that the core game systems and balance team have created some of the best and impactful updates the game has ever seen. From a major systemic rework of World vs. World to consistent balance updates that have massively improved build diversity and options across the board, to very solid reward improvements, guild hall updates, fashion inspection, upgrading the game to DirectX 11 for better performance and even visual improvements down the line, graphics customization improvements, and even more than all of that we don't have time to mention here. The core systems team has fully activated and is steadily making the game straight up better over time. I'm a particularly big fan of this approach because the history of ArenaNet has been releasing stuff and then promptly abandoning it, and leaving game modes like player versus player and world versus world to rot, which is tragic, as one of Guild Wars 2's greatest strengths is the variety of content and game modes available. I have great hopes for the continued work of this team, as there are still plenty of things that could certainly use a fresh coat of paint. There's already more on the horizon too, with some excellent upcoming changes to the player versus player automated tournament system, and even a new player versus player mode incoming, which nobody expected. Moving on to some more direct in-game features, let's talk about weapon mastery and the brand new weapons. The norm for Guild Wars 2 expansions was to release an elite specialization for each profession. These are subclasses that change up how your profession plays significantly and opens up new build options. The problem with this approach was not only that it was expensive development-wise, but it was also massively bloating the game. To be frank, the game is already a bit over the top with 27 elite specializations, and adding more would only make things crazier, especially from a new player perspective. The replacement for these was twofold. Weapon Mastery, which allows players to use elite specialization weapons that are usually locked to that specialization on any version of that profession, and a brand new weapon for each profession. I would say that this turned out okay, but with slightly mixed results. I think the main issue was actually the release order. The new weapons didn't get added to the game until about 6 months after release in the second quarterly update, and Weapon Mastery on its own was not quite as exciting as a new weapon. Being able to use any weapon did certainly shake things up a bit, but not as much as elite specializations did, and having to wait for new weapons meant that the launch of the expansion did not offer the same degree of opportunity as previous ones. I think it was never going to match elite specializations, and this was an inevitable step down, but releasing the weapons on launch would have been a massive improvement. This is a sentiment you're going to be hearing a lot during this section. The launch feature set of Secrets of the Obscure was fairly weak in my opinion, with most of the really juicy rewards and combat stuff showing up halfway through, which meant that there really wasn't a lot to do on launch. And while this of course doesn't matter from a player getting into the game now, I think the live experience is also extremely important, as this is how the expansion is experienced by players getting in on the action during launch, both veteran and noob alike. To start moving into that topic, we need to talk about relics, which were a combat feature that did get added with the expansion. Prior to Secrets of the Obscure, you could upgrade your gear with runes that gave additional attributes and a set bonus style effect that could be a variety of exciting effects. Secrets of the Obscure split this into two: runes retaining the attribute bonuses, and relics, a new item slot for your character having the special bonuses. I'm a relic enjoyer, and I think they provide ArenaNet another avenue to allow players to customize their build and also fill gaps and weaknesses that their build might have. Previously, many runes that had super cool effects were essentially useless, because often the attributes that came alongside it were just not that good. Decoupling the attributes and special effects removes this problem entirely. Sometimes you just want to summon a giant eye to attack your enemies, heal yourself with all of your attacks, heal allies when executing a combo, or just do a bit more damage. And speaking of doing a bit more damage, I think one of the only missteps that happened with relics was actually adding damaging and output relics in general. The issue is that, of course, in player versus environment, generally you just want to do the big numbers for damage and healing, and as a result of that, the relic diversity in player versus environment builds is much lower than other game modes, where there's a very solid amount of super exciting variety. I think things will improve over time, as there is definitely room to make some creative relics that will suit different builds in player versus environment, but I think it would have been really interesting to see what would have happened if pure output relics never existed. Something that's good about relics is that many of them have little quests or achievements linked to unlocking them, which I'm a fan of. I wish that Weapon Mastery and the new weapons also had quest chains of sorts attached to unlocking them for your account. As it stands, you unlock Weapon Mastery by just talking to a non-player character, and the new weapons by simply collecting several items in the main story mission. I actually thought I missed something on my playthrough at launch because of how fast Weapon Mastery acquisition was. The reason we've swerved over to relics is to talk about legendaries. Legendary items in Guild Wars 2 are the ultimate grind. There's no long-term vertical progression in the game, so instead we grind quality of life here. A key feature of a legendary item is that they are account-wide. You can use a legendary item on all of your characters at the same time and select any attributes you want on these items. Very handy. As a result of this, Guild Wars 2 expansions always add new legendaries, because having goals for players is super important. Secrets of the Obscure is no exception to this, introducing a legendary relic, and a set of open-world legendary armor, which is notable because all other legendary armor sets require playing either raids, player versus player, or world versus world. Now, all of that sounds fantastic, and on paper, it definitely is. The issue is that none of this was actually in the expansion at launch, so there kind of wasn't any of these big chase items to go after whatsoever. And although you could kind of pre-grind the materials for the armor before it was released, that's not really the same at all, and I think this was actually a major weakness of the expansion. The acquisition method for the legendaries was also somewhat underwhelming. You just craft it, which isn't exactly exceptional or terrible, I suppose, but I do prefer at least a little bit of an epic quest alongside the crafting to get special items like this. I think that when you're just getting your rewards by clicking a button rather than playing the game, it feels overly gamified and the immersion is shattered. ArenaNet have executed this well before too. The raid legendary armor requires, well, raiding and also an extensive collection that goes all over the world, and so do some of the other legendary trinkets and items too. And you know what? I like that. It was role-playing in my role-playing game, and it was good. Legendary armor is fairly grindy, but I don't think that's really a huge deal. It's supposed to be legendary after all. But what you have to grind to get there, well, that's another thing entirely. That's right, we have finally arrived at rifts, which you'll get to know intimately if you're going for the legendary armor. Rifts are a new activity added with Secrets of the Obscure. At their core, they are player-started events. You hunt down a rift by following the sparkly particle effects all over the world, and then you beat down the demons that emerge. On the face of it, rifts sound like rather a good idea. They'll take you all over the world and give you a reason to revisit locations you otherwise wouldn't. And there is something that is interesting about being able to start content on demand. Most of Guild Wars 2 is either on a scheduled timer or time-gated, so you can't really go full infinite degen grind mode, which is certainly something I'd say the game does lack in some respects. However, the problem here is the execution. It's very difficult to make content like this work in my opinion, maybe impossible actually. I'm just not sure if you can make content generic enough that it fits in anywhere, but also interesting enough mechanically that it engages players. And this is the issue rifts run into. They are rewarding, and they are infinite, and they do fit into the world from the roleplay perspective. But the gameplay is absolute mush. Waves of trash mobs that do nothing, followed by a bigger enemy that takes slightly longer to kill, but ultimately will not pose resistance. I'm not a rift enjoyer. I don't want to be clear. I'm not saying that rifts should be omega hard. I don't think open world content in Guild Wars 2 should be hard. It's intended to be the chill content in the game. But what I do look for in open world content are fun mechanics that encourage players to work together and coordinate a bit. And rifts do not do that. Maybe my expectations are too high, maybe rifts are just not for me, or maybe rifts are an idea that sounds good but doesn't work out in reality. Who knows? Rifts do have a bigger, badder version though, which showed up later in the expansion. Convergences. Convergences are private instances for up to 50 gamers that take you into hostile territory to battle some of the most fearsome cryptists out there. It's structured more like a large multi-stage event rather than the simplicity of rifts, and you'll have to take down a series of champion cryptists and their generals before facing the end boss. This end boss is not always the same too, randomly picked from a pool of convergence bosses that ArenaNet added to in the following quarterly releases, providing even more variety. Of course, that does mean that everything before the boss is always the same, which I do think is unfortunate. It would have been really cool if each boss had their own sequence of events leading up to when you confront them. During all of that, you'll also have to defend the wizard who brought you into the convergence and feed them essence, or you'll be booted out and fail. You can't respawn either, which is an interesting concept and totally different to how Guild Wars 2 usually works. When you die, you turn into a wisp and can only return to the battlefield when your team feeds enough essence to cast a resurrection spell. To give credit where it's due, there is actually a lot of potential for group min-maxing here, which actually is quite good fun in an organized team, especially with the addition of challenge mode and leaderboards for challenge mode, which although possess incredibly scuffed user interface, are an interesting feature that I hope to see integrated in future versions of this content down the line, and in fact in other content too. There's definitely some potential for that to actually end up happening too, as convergences are in fact looking to be an ongoing feature in future expansions, or at least in the next one, Janthir Wilds. The challenge mode for convergences unsurprisingly changes up the game somewhat. Firstly, you can choose what boss you want to tackle. You have a 30-minute time limit to finish the convergence, and also you can only get resurrected once before you are doomed to be a wisp until your team manages to finish off the convergence or you fail. It's a great idea, although somewhat lacking in execution again. The challenge mode doesn't really change the fights, it just juices up the health and damage, which isn't the most exciting thing in the world as opposed to adding extra mechanics and abilities. However, because of how out of the blue challenge mode convergences and leaderboards were, I get the impression that even adding challenge modes and leaderboards was very much an experimental thing, and perhaps not something that was even planned initially, so I think that explains why some parts are underdeveloped. For context, pretty much everything in Secrets of the Obscure was on a roadmap way in advance. Convergence challenge modes were not. I think there's some real potential here with convergences, which like Rifts are on-demand content but for larger groups or guilds, which is exactly the type of thing I like, and also, in my opinion, what the game could use a lot more of. I do wish that ArenaNet had been a bit more ambitious with the boss design though. Most of them are not super exciting, and nothing highlights how overly relaxing some of them are more than, funnily enough, the final convergence boss added, Umbriel, Halberd of House Orcus. This boss was intended to be a bit of a challenge, and you know what? It's actually really cool. I'm a big enjoyer of the 50-player epic raid-style experience that Guild Wars 2 does so well, and Umbriel is definitely getting there. There's room for improvement, and I'd like to see it go even further, as although the boss is dangerous, it's mostly just blasting you with damage and stuff to dodge, rather than requiring you as players to coordinate to overcome mechanics in some way, like some of the very best world bosses in Guild Wars 2 do. With all that said, I do think convergences show promise, and they are something that I will be anticipating in the next expansion. And maybe I'm coping, but I'd like to think ArenaNet has more things than Umbriel in mind and less like the Demon Knight. On-demand world bosses are an excellent idea, and they are more fun than grinding rifts if you want to get legendary armor, so I'll take it. Just get rid of the boss teleporting away every 25%, breaking the action while you trail across the map. That is low energy. Finally, we arrive at the last set of features in Secrets of the Obscure, the Masteries. Masteries are an account-wide, horizontal progression system in Guild Wars 2 that unlocks bonuses, special things your characters can do, and of course, features. Most of the Masteries in Secrets of the Obscure are all about getting legendary armor, combat enhancements or loot bonuses in rifts and convergences, and unlocking treasures in the open world, so there's not that much to say about them. They're very passive. The big one is the Sky Scale and its associated Mastery track. The Sky Scale is Guild Wars 2's second flying mount, and functions a bit like a helicopter. The reason it's ended up in this expansion is because it's probably the mount with the most convoluted and somewhat soul-crushing acquisition method. By contrast, it's absolutely trivial to get in Secrets of the Obscure, and you can power it up with some masteries like being able to breathe fireballs and fly along ley lines, and even launch yourself onto your mount in combat. Many of these masteries also apply to the Griffin, the first flying mount in the game, which is a nice touch. And to get full power out of your Sky Scale, you will still have to go back to Path of Fire to unlock the Sky Scale the old-fashioned way and get even more masteries. There's no escape from that. I'm fairly neutral on the Sky Scale. It's certainly one of the most useful mounts for getting around, as essentially having fly hack is quite good for that sort of thing. I do think it's one of the less fun mounts to use in the game, because it's quite slow and not quite as dynamic as the others. I'd love to see an expansion designed around the Roller Beetle or the Griffin, which could honestly have whole games designed around them in their own right. Speaking of which, a negative consequence of the Sky Scale being a prominent feature of the expansion is that the maps are a bit of a pain to get around without it, and although everyone will have the Sky Scale, it is quite nice to have options, and the map design does somewhat restrict that. I'll complain about the Sky Scale in combat in the next segment, but for now, that'll do. If you like flying around on dragons, then the Sky Scale's for you. And indeed, that concludes the feature set of Secrets of the Obscure. Ah, the wonderful world of encounter design. Unfortunately, this is the absolute brutal downfall of Secrets of the Obscure. As mentioned in the open world section, the large-scale boss events in Secrets of the Obscure are easily among the weakest in the entire game, and this is very much a running theme throughout the expansion. The game looks and sounds great, but it really doesn't play great, with one notable exception that deserves its own section entirely. If I had to sum it up, I would say that encounters in Secrets of the Obscure mostly lack intentionality and vision, often consisting of random abilities thrown together that do not lead to engaging encounters that challenge players to use their skills and coordination to overcome. In fact, my major criticism of the open world is that the bosses simply sit there and do nothing. In the case of the final boss of the Undertus encounter, all too literally, where you fight a giant tentacle monster that conveniently just bites a platform and lets you beat it down while doing absolutely nothing in retaliation. While we're on the subject of Amnitus, I also now need to complain about how ArenaNet used mounts in encounters. This has been a pattern running through previous expansions too, and ArenaNet once again want you to fight things with your mount. There are significant sections of encounters that are supposed to be insanely epic, where you need to fly on your dragon and launch fireballs to defeat enemies. This sounds pretty cool, but then you realize that means you are taken out of Guild Wars 2's excellent combat system and thrown into a reality where your only button to press is the 2 key. The fun part about mounts is all about the movement, especially when it comes to flying mounts. This is funny actually, but because of my experiences in Guild Wars 2 with mounts in combat, I was absolutely dreading World of Warcraft doing the same in Dragonflight, only to find out that they completely understood the assignment and utilized their actual full yoink of Guild Wars 2's flying mounts in incredibly fun ways, by adding flying gauntlets in between boss phases in the second to last raid boss of the expansion, and even a mythic-only mechanic where you need to mount up to catch bombs falling to the ground before they explode and then dive bomb down to break your allies out of entangling roots. It's a very good encounter, and I was highly impressed that Blizzard was able to make mount interactions in raids fun. I do think the Skyscale is partially to blame for this, as it is one of the less fun mounts to use in the game, but the decision to have such a focus on mounted combat instead of mounted movement is baffling to me. Guild Wars 2's combat system is the best in the business. I think anything that takes you away from that and replaces it with pressing one button is a huge error. Moving back to encounters, the first map of the expansion, Skywatch Archipelago, doesn't fare any better, with a huge amount of the main event taken up by collecting orbs without really fighting anything, culminating in a visually exciting finale, including parts of the terrain breaking apart, with a bunch of enemies that just attack you with random attacks. And this is the unfortunate story of the encounters in Secrets of the Obscure. They're very much all style and lacking in substance, which is a real shame because the stories they're telling are compelling. It's a real visual feast too, which means everything is still epic the first few times. I really enjoyed exploring the maps and playing through all of the main and side events, but because there just isn't solid gameplay to support it, I don't find myself wanting to replay the content very much at all. Now, we have to talk about the instance content. Secrets of the Obscure has 2 strike missions, which are essentially single boss raids, and 1 fractal, which is Guild Wars 2's version of a dungeon. And you know what? We're going to start on a positive note, with what is, for some players, including myself, the absolute high point of the expansion, and indeed one of the strongest pieces of content the game has ever released. Cerus, the Bloodied Lord. Cerus is a solid fight on normal mode, a build-a-boss style encounter where you have to choose which of his many abilities to weaken and empower by defeating his embodiments of sins that represent different attacks. It's a good encounter with robust mechanical design. The challenge mode is where things really activate. A seemingly simple change of clones of Cerus appearing and casting extra abilities turns the fight into a really exciting overlapping puzzle for players to solve, and with a hefty damage and healing check thrown on top of all of that, you end up with probably the best designed encounter in Guild Wars 2 to date. It created an epic race to worlds first around it, and it was a full-on community event in the game, which was a real treat as such things are relatively rare in Guild Wars 2. Throw that together with an incredible thematic design and you've got one hell of an encounter. It's not directly related to the encounter design, but I have to bring this up. The Cerus thematic design is among my favorite in the game. Cerus is a bully. He's never known real resistance before and he picks on people when they're at their weakest. And by the time you fight him for real, you've turned the tables. He's also deeply insecure, being the lesser of 2 brothers, and the voice acting and music captures his character perfectly. The track, The Bloodied Lord, is my favorite in the entire Secrets of the Obscure soundtrack, and very much sells you that you should be deeply afraid of Cerus, but also that he's just a little bit scared of you too. All of the above, combined with epic animations and ability effects, elevate Cerus from an excellent encounter to an immersive experience that I really can't praise enough. As much as I'd like to, I can't only talk about Ceres. I'm afraid we have to move on to what remains. Cosmic Observatory Normal Mode is a mediocre and somewhat uninspired encounter containing essentially disconnected mechanics that don't have much cohesion, but whatever, I'm sure the challenge mode will be much better. Cosmic Observatory Challenge Mode was the worst and most brutally disappointing encounter ever released in Guild Wars 2 history, and it wasn't even close. The challenge mode added seemingly random and reused mechanics on top of the existing ones, without meaningfully changing how the fight plays out. Area attacks that are placed randomly, where you never really interact with them, enemies during an intermission that do absolutely nothing but waste your time, and green circles that players need to stack in to survive, which could have been interesting, except the circles themselves can be stacked, making the mechanic utterly pointless. A notable mistake that was fixed with a similar mechanic on Ceres, by the way. It's actually hard to quantify how demoralizing this release really was. The community was still coming off the high of some really great content in the previous expansion, End of Dragons, and to go from that to this was an absolutely savage awakening. Bear in mind that Ceres Challenge Mode released 3 months after Cosmic Observatory Challenge Mode, so things were looking incredibly bleak at this point. One important and more general point of criticism that I have to raise regarding strike missions is that the difficulty curve is quite problematic. There are only 2 difficulty options, normal and challenge mode. As you might imagine, this makes it very difficult to serve players of all experience levels. Normal mode is almost trivial mechanically, but still has a lot of health, making it both quite a slog for newer players, but also still very easy and unengaging for veteran players. On the flip side, challenge mode, especially Ceres challenge mode, is quite brutal, and orders of magnitude harder than the normal mode, which is awesome for very sweaty players, but my criticism here is that I don't think the strike missions serve entry-level and mid-core players well at all. And that's kind of the point of difficulty settings to begin with, as of course that's where most players are. I do have high hopes for the next expansion though, as ArenaNet did go back and make some solid adjustments to Ceres Challenge Mode to make it a bit more approachable after its release, and they have already confirmed the new raid in Janthea Wilds to have 4 difficulty settings per encounter, including the brilliant decision to add an open world version as the easiest setting. At the other extreme, each encounter will also have a legendary mode, cranking it up to 11, so they've definitely learned their lesson in that regard. There's a really cool story behind Legendary Mode too. Ceres was actually bugged on release and had far too much health, but instead of fully reducing it, the developers decided to keep a higher health version around alongside the intended version as a so-called Legendary Mode, even adding a special purple title for completing it. I think ArenaNet did a really good job handling that situation, and it's one of those mistakes into miracles moments where a bug shaped the course of the game for the better. You may have noticed that a while back I said Cosmic Observatory was the worst encounter in the game, and well, unfortunately that's because the Lonely Tower fractal was yet to come. I'm not going to go into full detail about exactly why the Lonely Tower fractal isn't good. I have a full video on the topic that you can watch if you are interested, but the too long didn't watch is that Guild Wars 2 has lacked proper dungeon-style content for a long time. And although Lonely Tower is an attempt to go back to that somewhat, it doesn't quite connect. To be frank, there simply isn't that much to talk about in terms of encounter design outside of the end boss, which says something on its own, I think. So let's talk about that end boss a bit. Eparch is the end boss of the Lonely Tower fractal, and very much like Cosmic Observatory, lacks intentionality, feeling much more like a collection of random attacks rather than a cohesive encounter, and that's very much the core problem. The boss just does attacks from 100 to 0. No phases, no change, or anything combined with a sizable health pool creates an encounter that simply isn't fun. Things got even worse with the subsequent release of the Challenge Mode, which not only introduced some pretty seriously unfun mechanics, but was also tuned on release to the point where the only strategy players were using was exploiting a bug, and most players simply avoided the fractal entirely and continued to do so even after bug fixes and nerfs. The offending mechanic is the addition of an intermission at 66% and 33%, where you have to close portals by defeating large mini-bosses while preventing small enemies from reaching the boss, permanently empowering him if any make it. This isn't a bad idea in principle, but the issue is that if this happens, you cannot do anything to remove this empowerment. It's also very unclear how close the enemies can get before they get eaten, and it's not that far, even at the best of times because of how small the arena is. Sometimes the enemies ignore immobilize and just keep going anyway, and sometimes even if you kill them, the boss eats them anyway. And if you finish the intermission by killing the large enemies, then closing the portals, but the smaller enemies are still alive, sometimes the boss gets empowered anyway. The empowerments are also designed in such a way that if the boss does get empowered, the fight will become incredibly annoying, as whenever the boss hits you, you'll constantly have all positive buffs on yourself corrupted, and so many negative effects applied to you that you won't be able to play the game. And it's not super practical to avoid these attacks because you have to constantly move around, inevitably walking over damaging lines to collect orbs so the boss doesn't get even more empowered, and that will mean you will inevitably get hit and brutally destroyed. I want to be very clear here. The problem is not that the fight is hard. In its post-nerf state with the right strategy, it's actually quite easy. One of the easiest challenge mode fractals, in fact. The problem is that the mechanics are not particularly fun to interact with, they're finicky and buggy, and if anything starts to go wrong, you can't really recover and often end up wiping or resetting the encounter. I just recorded this segment and realized I said I wasn't going to go into detail about Epoch and then proceeded to do so immediately. I think that happened because Epoch is probably the only release in Guild Wars 2's history that made me a bit angry with how not good it is, so I can't resist talking about it. You're welcome. Epoch's design managed to deflate the community after the glorious Ceres challenge mode, and has very unfortunately cast doubt over the future of not only fractals, but encounter design in general in Guild Wars 2. And I hate to say it, but I don't exactly blame people for being worried, even though I myself remain cautiously optimistic. As a final side note, Epoch also suffers from the opposite of one of Ceres's greatest strengths. The thematic elements are mediocre. The boss has no voice lines during the encounter, remaining entirely silent, and the arena is also not particularly exciting by comparison. As a final note, one thing that's notably absent from boss design in Secrets of the Obscure are proper tanking mechanics. The strike mission bosses are fixed in place, and this does lead to them feeling less dynamic than they otherwise could. It's a shame too, because Ceres's walking animation is very imposing. He can move, he just doesn't want to. That's all I've got to say on encounter design and the gameplay of Secrets of the Obscure. Needless to say, a bit of a mixed bag. In my opinion, ArenaNet have not yet demonstrated that the new model can deliver the same level of quality and quantity that players expect, and they certainly have a lot to prove in the next expansion, Janthea Wilds. ArenaNet agreed in a retrospective blog post that some parts of the expansion were not where they wanted them to be, and I'm very much hoping that they're able to refine their development strategy and make it work. I really want to see ArenaNet succeed in this, because I have a lot of respect for Josh Davis, who is the current game director, and indeed for all the developers at ArenaNet. I do think that their new strategy is a very good one, and makes a lot of sense to sustain the game going forward. It's all just going to come down to execution. Those are all of my many thoughts on Guild Wars 2 Secrets of the Obscure. It's certainly an interesting point in the game's journey, and I'm full of a cautious optimism for the Janthea Wilds and beyond. The feature set is looking great, and if ArenaNet can learn from what went wrong in Secrets of the Obscure, then I think it should work out very, very well. We'll see how well that sentiment ages very soon. Be sure to leave a comment telling me how unbelievably right I am about everything, like the video, and subscribe for more. You could even buy Guild Wars 2 using my referral link after such a glowing review of this expansion. Go watch every other video I've ever made, follow all the social media, and tune in to my streams where I reenact this video live on a daily basis. This type of content is what I really enjoy making over here on YouTube, and what I want to do a lot more of in the future. If you like it too and want to support it, then head on over to my Patreon, where you can get early access to what's coming up next, extra stuff, and get your spot in this part of the video while everyone still fits on the screen. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.